The abandonment order was signed at 0317 hours. She knows this because she was still alive at 0317 hours, which means she was alive to hear the radio go quiet. It does not go quiet on its own. A radio on an active operation is a living thing, a heartbeat, constant low-level noise and traffic that the people on it stop consciously noticing after the first few days. When it stops, you notice. When the silence is deliberate, when someone has made a decision on the other end that has produced the silence, you know before you're told. She and 5 others were in a compound in the Korengal Valley with 22 enemy fighters closing from 3 sides and a 4-vehicle convoy 16 kilometers north that should have been inbound for the past 40 minutes. She keyed her comms. Nothing. She tried the alternate frequency. Nothing. She tried the emergency channel. The channel that was supposed to be monitored at all times. The channel that was supposed to produce a response even if the sky was falling. Nothing. Sergeant First Class Dara Osei looked at her from across the compound's inner courtyard. They were in cover behind a low stone wall, the kind of wall that had been built for livestock at some point in the last century, and was now providing cover for 2 members of an Army Special Forces team that had been left without an answer. She read his face. He read hers. Neither of them said anything. She got back to work. What came next was 4 hours and 21 minutes of the most precise, close-quarters defensive work she had ever executed. She and OC and the remaining 4 members of her element held the compound through the night, using what they had: 2 M4A1s with 1 spare magazine each between them, a single fragmentation grenade that she saved until she was certain she needed it, a SIG P320 on her hip, and the specific kind of clarity that descends on people who understand that the options have reduced to 1. She had been in situations before that had looked like this. She had never been in one that was this. By 0600, when the first light came over the eastern ridge and the enemy fighters had disengaged to avoid daylight exposure, there were 14 enemy combatants who were no longer combatants, and 4 of her 6 people were still on their feet. Martinez was down, a GSW to the right leg, arterial. She had packed it herself at 0140 while firing one-handed over the wall. He was alive because she had packed it fast and correctly, and because he was the kind of man who refused to die as a point of personal principle. Reyes had taken a round through the shoulder that was through and through, bone damage, but no critical structure. He was functional enough. At 0613, a helicopter appeared from the north. Not the convoy. A medevac scrambled after a junior signals officer at the FOB had noticed the emergency channel had been manually deactivated and raised an alarm up the chain without authorization. The medevac pilot, a warrant officer she would never forget, came in low and fast through a valley that was officially not cleared. She called it herself as she was loading Martinez. She said, "Who sent you?" The pilot said, "Specialist Ito flagged a channel deactivation on watch. I went without authorization. You're going to have to cover for me when this is over." She said, "I'll cover for you." She never had to. Specialist Ito and the pilot were eventually the only people who came through the aftermath without a reprimand. She flew out with her team. She left the compound. She did not leave the question of why the channel had been deactivated. The AR-15-6 investigation took 3 weeks. She was interviewed twice. She gave her account twice of exactly what had occurred: the radio silence, the timeline, the channel status when she arrived, and when she attempted contact. The investigation concluded: communications failure, cause undetermined, no individual culpability found. She had heard language like this before. She understood what it meant. She went to her battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, with a formal request to review the communications log from the operations center for the period in question. She was told that the log was not available for her review at her clearance level. She filed a formal complaint under Article 138, the military grievance mechanism that technically gives service members recourse against superior officers. It was received, acknowledged, and filed under a tracking number she was told she would be able to check on. 6 months later, the tracking number returned no record. She requested a meeting with the commanding general of the theater, Major General Lund. Lund's aide informed her that General Lund was not available for the nature of inquiry she was describing, and suggested she pursue the matter through the Inspector General's office. The IG's office told her the matter had been reviewed and closed. She sat in the IG waiting room for 45 minutes after being told this. A corporal at the front desk looked at her the way young soldiers look at people who are beginning to understand how the architecture actually works. With a kind of apologetic incomprehension, she thanked the corporal. She stood up. She walked out. She requested and was granted terminal leave for accumulated days. She used the leave to fly to Fort Meade, where she had a contact in the Signals Intelligence Directorate, a woman she had gone through Special Forces assessment with a decade ago, who had since moved into the kind of work that didn't appear on public organizational charts. Her name was Captain Sonia Park. Sonia took her to lunch and listened without speaking for 45 minutes. Then Sonia said, "The channel deactivation. Was it logged?" She said, "The log showed no entry." Sonia said, "A log that shows no entry for an action that definitely occurred is a modified log." She said, "Yes." Sonia said, "The person with authority to modify the Ops Center log at that level is the Duty General Officer." She said, "I know." Sonia looked at her for a long time. Sonia said, "The Duty General Officer for your theater for that period was Lund." She already knew. She had already run the duty roster herself. She had just needed to hear it from someone who could access the unmodified version. Sonia said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to think about it very carefully." She went back to her room. She sat with it for 3 days. Then she requested early separation from the army, citing personal reasons, which is a request that is granted without examination as a matter of institutional policy. Her separation was processed in 2 weeks. She was given an honorable discharge and a handshake from a lieutenant colonel she had never met. She drove off post with a duffel bag and the encrypted drive she had built before leaving, which contained everything she had been able to compile: duty rosters, the timeline, her formal complaint tracking history, the IG closure documentation, the names. Above all of the names, at the top of the list, was Major General William Lund. 8 bodyguards. She had been counting. She was gone for 18 months. This is not hyperbole. There was no signal, no financial trace, no address. She had anticipated that Lund or people adjacent to Lund would want to know where she was if the matter appeared to be escalating. And so she had made sure there was nothing to find. She'd crossed into Mexico by car, drawn the remaining balance of her accounts in cash from an ATM in Nogales, and destroyed her phone. She crossed back into the United States 7 weeks later under a different arrangement that she had organized through a former intelligence colleague who asked no questions in exchange for a professional debt. She accepted freely. She spent the first 3 months in a rural location in New Mexico that had been used as a training facility for private security contractors. It was largely empty when she arrived. She paid for access in cash to a caretaker who did not ask what she was training for. He had the look of a man who had seen enough varieties of grief to understand that some people needed somewhere to point a rifle for a while. She ran, she lifted, she ran more. She fired a Barrett M82 .50 caliber at ranges that increased systematically over the 3 months until she was regularly hitting a static target at 2,200 meters and had begun working on the variables that governed anything beyond that. At 2,200 meters, the .50 caliber BMG round is in the air for over 2.5 seconds. The wind during that time is not the wind at the moment you fire. It is the aggregate wind across the entire distance, shifting, layered, different at different altitudes. Learning to read it is learning to read a different language. She learned. After New Mexico, she moved north. She worked for 3 months as a security consultant for a private firm in Montana that provided risk assessment for mining operations. She used a different name, which the firm was incurious about. She was good at the work. She took the bay, stayed in a studio apartment, and ran in the mornings on a trail that climbed 600 meters above the valley floor. At the top of the trail, on a clear day, you could see for what felt like the whole width of the world. She thought about Martinez, how his leg had healed. She knew this from a contact at the hospital where he'd been treated, who had passed her an update at her request. He was walking. He had a slight gait change. He had returned to duty. She thought about the medevac pilot and specialist Ito, the 2 people who had come back for them without authorization. She thought about the radio going quiet at 0317. She thought about Lund signing the order. She thought about the Bodyguards. She had spent 4 months running detailed surveillance on Lund's security arrangements through Sonia, who continued to feed her information with a specificity that told her Sonia had already decided whose side she was on. Lund had a personal protection detail of 8. Former special operations, 2 of them. The other 6 were competent federal contractor types, professional, trained, not exceptional. His detail operated on a standard rotation. 2 with him at all times, 2 on outer perimeter, 2 on vehicular coverage, 2 off rotation. It changed every 8 hours. His schedule was largely fixed. Residence in a quiet part of Northern Virginia. Meetings at the Pentagon 4 days a week. A private club he used Thursday evenings. A house in Vermont he visited on alternating weekends. She spent 6 months identifying the soft point. The Vermont house was it. Not because it was unguarded. It wasn't. He brought a reduced detail there. 4 instead of 8. The logic being that a rural Vermont address known only to his close circle was lower risk than his Virginia residence. He was wrong about that. The Vermont house was on a county road, set back 300 meters from the road on a cleared lot, bordered by forest on 3 sides. She had been to that forest. She knew its geometry. The tree line on the north side was 1,100 meters from the house's rear deck. Lund ate dinner on the rear deck on Saturday evenings when the weather permitted. She had been building the evidentiary case in parallel with the physical preparation. through contacts she had developed over years in the intelligence and special operations communities, she assembled a record that eventually took 11 months to complete. What she found was not simply an officer who had made a bad decision under pressure. What she found was a pattern. Lund had deactivated emergency channels before, not her situation. A previous incident, 14 months earlier, involving a different element in a different theater. That incident had been classified and the communications failure attributed to equipment malfunction. The element involved had suffered two KIA and one WIA before being extracted by a unit that had been on a different operation and had responded to gunfire they could hear from 3 kilometers away. The families of the two KIA had been told equipment failure. Lund had also, over the course of his career, developed a relationship with a defense contracting company that provided communications infrastructure to several operational theaters. His relationship with the company's principal, a man named Garrett Vance, predated his current command by a decade. It included a financial relationship that had been obscured through a real estate arrangement in Florida. Lund's wife's name on a property that Vance's company had purchased and immediately leased back to her at below market rate. It was not subtle. It was the kind of arrangement that survives because nobody looks for it, and nobody looks for it because the person who might look is the person who benefits from not looking. The communications infrastructure contracts that Lund's theater had awarded to Vance's company were worth $340 million over 4 years. She had been left in the Korengal Valley. Her team had been left because an active channel would have required a response. A response would have brought scrutiny. Scrutiny at that particular moment had created risk for a contract that was worth $340 million. She put all of it in a package. She sent the package to a federal prosecutor, a Senate Intelligence Committee staffer, and a journalist she trusted through 2 intermediaries. Then she went to Vermont. She went in 4 days before she intended to act. Not to the house. Into the forest, she moved through the tree line at night with a pack she had reduced to 41 pounds. Barrett M82 broken down, ammunition, water, emergency medical kit, a radio scanner, and 9 energy bars she did not intend to eat unless she needed them. She wore a ghillie suit she had built herself in New Mexico, cut from local vegetation, which had taken 3 days and which she had tested in varying light conditions before trusting it. She found a position in the tree line on the north side, 1,100 meters from the rear deck. Elevation advantage of approximately 12 meters, clear sight line through a natural gap in the tree coverage. She lay there for 2 days. She observed the detail's rotation. 4 men, as Sonia had described, 2 on the house perimeter, walking a circuit every 14 minutes. 1 at the vehicle in the front drive, 1 with Lund at all times. She timed them. She ran the numbers. She looked at the gap in the trees and the angle to the deck and the way the light changed at different hours of the day. She was not going to kill him. This required clarity, because there were moments in those 2 days in the tree line when the question presented itself differently. When she thought about the radio going quiet, when she thought about Martinez packing his own wound with her hand over his, when she thought about the 2 soldiers from the previous incident whose families had been told equipment failure, she went through it every time it presented itself. She was not going to kill him. She was going to deliver something to him that he could not recover from. She was going to make him understand exactly what she had built. The evidence package, the prosecutorial contact, the congressional connection. And she was going to give him one option, which was to turn himself in. Not because she believed he deserved the option, because she had decided, in the months of preparation, that the difference between justice and revenge was this. Justice produced accountability that outlasted the moment. Revenge produced a moment that was gone as soon as it was over. She wanted accountability that outlasted the moment. She still had the Barrett out because the 8 bodyguards, reduced to 4 here, but still 8 in the full configuration, had required a contingency. She was not bringing the rifle to the confrontation. She was bringing it because the confrontation required a certain architecture of leverage, and part of that architecture was the demonstrated fact that she had been 1,100 meters away from his dinner table for 2 days without anyone knowing. He came out at 1845. She watched him through the scope. He was 61 years old, thicker through the middle than his official photograph suggested, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent a decade as one of the most powerful military officers in his theater, and now moved through the world as though it had been built to accommodate him. He had a glass of something. He sat in a deck chair. He looked at the tree line, not looking for anything, just looking at the landscape, the way people look at things they don't actually see. The bodyguard with him on the deck was standing by the door, far enough back to be out of his peripheral line of sight. She put the crosshairs of the Barrett on the glass in his hand. She breathed. She waited. At 1852, his phone buzzed on the deck table. He looked at the screen. He picked it up. He read whatever was there. He put it down. That was her message. She had sent it through an encrypted relay set to deliver at precisely 1852. It said, "General Lund, I have been in the tree line to your north for 48 hours. You are currently in my sights. I am not going to use what I have on you here. I am going to give you a number to call. You will call it within 30 minutes. The person who answers will tell you what has already been submitted and to whom. After that conversation, you will have a decision to make." She watched him read it. She watched him sit very still. He did not call to his detail. He did not stand up. He sat in the chair for 23 seconds without moving. Then he picked up the phone. He called the number. The call lasted 11 minutes. She timed it. The person on the other end of the number was an attorney, one she had arranged specifically for this purpose, who had been briefed on the evidence package and had agreed, for reasons that mixed professional interest and something more like conviction, to take the call and make the disclosure. She watched Lund sit in the chair for the full 11 minutes. He did not stand. He did not speak much. She could see him occasionally responding, but mostly listening, which was the correct response to being told that a federal prosecutor had a $340 million contracting relationship, 2 communications tampering incidents, 2 soldiers' deaths, and a financial arrangement in Florida, and that a Congressional Intelligence Committee staffer had been briefed and was expecting his call. At the 11-minute mark, he put the phone down. He sat for another long moment. He looked at the tree line again. He said something to the bodyguard at the door. The bodyguard came forward. Lund said something else. The bodyguard reached for his radio. She stayed in position. She watched. What came next confirmed everything she needed to know about her re-ed on him. The bodyguard made a call, and within 6 minutes, a vehicle left the property. Not in her direction. North, toward the main road. He was having his attorney called. She stayed in position for another hour and 40 minutes, until dark. while the property's activity indicated a man who was consulting with legal counsel by phone. Then she broke down the Barrett M82, packed her kit, and moved back through the forest to the vehicle she had staged 4 kilometers east on a forestry road. She drove through the night. Sergeant First Class Dara Osei found her 3 weeks later. She did not know how. She had been careful. She was not certain she wanted to know the methodology, because it suggested a capability gap in her own operational security that she would need to address. He found her in a diner in western Pennsylvania on a Tuesday morning. He sat down across from her booth without being invited. She said, "How did you find me?" He said, "Park." She thought you needed to know what was happening. She said, "What's happening?" He said, "Lund's people have been asking questions. They've identified 2 people from your old unit as possible contacts. They've been around, watching." She said, "Who are they watching?" He said, "Me and Rivera. They've been trying to figure out if we were in contact with you." She thought about this. She said, "Are you being followed now?" He said, "I lost them in Pittsburgh. I'm clean." She looked at him across the table. Osei had been her element sergeant for 3 of her last 4 deployments. He was the kind of person who could disappear into any environment and survive indefinitely on professional competence and good judgment. He had also, on the night in the Korengal Valley, held a position alone under direct fire for 22 minutes while she extracted Martinez. He had a 3-centimeter scar on his left forearm from that night that she had helped clean and dress while they were waiting for the medevac. She said, "If Lund's people are watching you and Rivera, he's trying to build a counter-narrative. He wants to identify my contacts so he can present this as a conspiracy rather than a disclosure." Osei said, "That's what I figured too." She said, "Can Rivera handle it?" Osei said, "Rivera is fine. Rivera is the most professionally composed person I have ever met in my life." She almost smiled. She said, "You shouldn't be here." He said, "I know. I came anyway." She looked at him. She said, "Osei, what happened in the Korengal Valley? What happened to our team? I need you to know that the accountability for it is moving. It's in the right channels now. You don't need to be part of what I'm doing. In fact, it's better for you if you're not." He said, "Better for me has never been the primary consideration in this unit." She said, "We're not a unit anymore. I got out. You're still in." He said, "I know. That's why I'm here. You need a second pair of eyes on your exit, and I'm in a better legal position to provide that than you are." She thought about it. She said, "If I let you help with the exit, it can't touch anything that happened before." He said, "Understood." She said, "You went for a drive. You ate breakfast in Pennsylvania. You drove home." He said, "That's all this was." He helped her identify the 2 people who had been asking questions in her vicinity and establish their movements. They were, as she had suspected, private investigators working through a law firm connected to Lund's personal attorney. Not law enforcement, not federal agents. People hired to build a picture. She had already anticipated this. It was part of the architecture she had built. The evidence package was structured so that any attempt by Lund to present her as an unstable or criminal actor would require him to explain in detail why she had become one, which required him to explain what had happened in the Korengal Valley, which was exactly what the prosecutor already had. He had no good move. She had built the architecture, so he didn't. Osei left. She watched his vehicle disappear at the end of the road. She sat with the fact of him being there, the fact that he had found her, that he had come, that he had done it as simply and directly as that, without drama, the way her team had always operated. She sat with the particular weight of being known by people who had been in the same dark with you. Then she went back to work. The federal indictment was filed 43 days after the Vermont confrontation. Major General William Lund, retired, charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 1512, witness tampering and obstruction of proceedings, and under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for dereliction of duty, resulting in the deaths of 2 service members in the prior incident, and for the deliberate deactivation of emergency communication channels in 2 separate instances. The financial relationship with Garrett Vance's contracting company was a separate matter, filed by a different prosecutor in a different district. But the 2 cases were immediately connected in the press coverage that began the same day. She read about it on a laptop in a library in a small city in Ohio that she had stopped in for no particular reason. The library was warm. Outside, it was raining. A child at the next table was working through a book about dinosaurs with an expression of total absorption. She read the filing. She noted the charges. She checked the names of the soldiers from the previous incident. The 2 KIA, whose families had been told equipment failure. Their names were in the filing. They were in the record now. She closed the laptop. She sat for a while. Sonia Park reached her through the same channel she had always used. A message through a service that appeared to be a scheduling app and was, functionally, a secure communication relay Sonia had built for her own use years ago. The message said, "The IG's office is reopening the Martinez incident as a separate inquiry. They found the modified log. They have the original." Lund's aide modified it at his instruction 4 hours after the event. The aide is cooperating. She wrote back, "How's the aide?" Sonia wrote, "Scared. Cooperative. He's 26. He thought he was following a legal order." She wrote, "He probably was. That's how it works." Sonia wrote, "There's something else. One of the investigators wants to talk to you, formally. They know you're out there. They know what you provided and how." She considered this. She wrote, "What are the terms?" Sonia wrote, "No criminal referral for how you obtained the documents. They want your account of the Korengal Valley, on the record. They want to understand the timeline of the comm failure from your position." She wrote, "That's my testimony. They don't need immunity for my testimony. They just need to ask." Sonia wrote, "I'll pass that along." She put the communication device in her pocket and looked out the window of the library at the rain. She thought about standing orders. She thought about the emergency channel that was supposed to be monitored at all times. She thought about the specific silence of 0317 in the Korengal Valley, which was not the silence of equipment, malfunction, or navigational error, but the silence of a man who had made a decision. She was going to say all of that, on the record, in a room with investigators. She was going to say it precisely and without embellishment, and she was going to say it until every word of it was part of the permanent record. That was the last thing she had to do. The debrief was conducted in a conference room in a federal building she had been directed to through her attorney, who had met her in the lobby and briefed her on the procedural framework in 45 seconds, which was the right amount of time, because she already understood the framework. There were 2 investigators and a military attorney present. The investigators were professional and precise. The military attorney was there to manage UCMJ implications. She gave her testimony over 4 hours. She covered every element. Her team's grid confirmation at 2147. The emergency channel attempt, the alternate frequency, the specific content of each transmission she had made, and the absence of any response. The timeline between Petrov's final check-in and the AC-130 engagement, what she had found afterward about the duty roster. She answered every question. She did not embellish. She did not editorialize. She gave the facts in the order they had occurred, as precisely as her memory, which was very precise, allowed. At the end, the lead investigator thanked her. She said, "The 2 soldiers from the previous incident, they're in the indictment." The investigator said, "Yes." She said, "Will their families be notified before this goes public?" The investigator paused, said, "That would be done by the notification officers, which is a separate process." She said, "I'm asking if it will be done before it goes public." The investigator looked at her, said, "I'll flag it." She said, "Thank you." She stood up. She shook the investigator's hands. She thanked the military attorney. She walked out of the conference room. Her attorney was waiting in the corridor. He said, "That went well." She said, "Yes." She walked out of the building. The rain had stopped. The sky was the particular clear gray of late autumn. The kind of sky that isn't dark, but isn't bright. A sky that doesn't make promises. She stood on the steps for a moment. She had 8 bodyguards left on her accounting, and she had dealt with all 8 of them by building something Lund's team could not dismantle. The 8 bodyguards, the physical ones in Vermont, had been irrelevant. That was the point. You don't breach the perimeter if you can remove the ground the perimeter is standing on. She had spent 18 months removing the ground. 11 minutes on that deck in Vermont, and it had all been in motion. The Congressional Intelligence Committee released a public summary of its inquiry 6 months after the Lund indictment. The summary described, in the carefully measured language that congressional summaries use when they are trying to say something serious without triggering consequences for institutions that cannot afford those consequences, a pattern of communications management failures across multiple theaters over a period of several years. It named no names. The names were in the classified version, which she would never see and did not need to. It described the structural vulnerability, that emergency channel protocols were not adequately audited, that duty officer accountability for channel status was insufficient, and that the documentation requirements for channel deactivation during active operations were inadequate. She read it in a library in Cincinnati. She had stopped there for 3 days because she needed to stop somewhere, and Cincinnati was where the car had stopped. The summary was exactly what congressional inquiries produce when they are working correctly, and the pressure is sufficient, and someone has given them something they can't ignore. A measured, structured, non-attributive description of a systemic failure that would result in procedural changes that would take years to implement and would, when implemented, make the specific failure that had killed her team and the 2 soldiers before them less likely to recur. Less likely. Not impossible. Less likely. She thought about that for a long time. She was not naive. She understood that the procedural change was real and imperfect and necessary. She understood that the structural vulnerability had produced Lund's ability to act the way he had acted, and that removing the vulnerability removed the next Lund's ability to do the same thing. She understood that this was how institutional change worked when it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, in response to specific documented failures, never in response to the thing itself, until the thing had already happened and someone had made sure it was in the record. She had made sure it was in the record. The library was warm. A man at the next table was sleeping over a newspaper. The child she had noticed earlier was still working through the dinosaur book with the same expression of total absorption. She closed the congressional summary tab. She ordered more coffee. She was not done. Osei found her one more time. This time, she had given him the number, which was a different kind of finding. He was already out. Medical separation for a wrist injury sustained during a training exercise that had left him below the physical standard for continued Special Forces service. He had a consulting offer from a firm in D.C. He had not taken it yet. She met him at a place they both knew, a diner near Fort Bragg that had been serving breakfast to soldiers for 30 years and had the particular quality of a place that exists at the edge of something very large, neither inside nor outside it. She said, "How's the wrist?" he said. "Works fine for everything except talking it. They found a ligament that had torn twice and healed wrong. The surgeon said it was the second healing that caused the problem." She said, "Are you going to consult?" He said, "Probably. Haven't decided." They ate. The coffee was bad. She drank it. He said, "Mara, what are you going to do?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "You could go back." She said, "The discharge was honorable. The reinstatement path is possible." He said, "Is it what you want?" She thought about it. She said, "I want to be useful in a way that means something. I don't know if that's back inside the institution or outside of it. I did this outside of it and it worked. That tells me something." He said, "It tells you that you're better at this when you're not carrying a desk." She almost laughed. She said, "That's not what I said." He said, "It's what you meant." She didn't argue. They sat with the bad coffee and the morning light coming through the window at the angle it does at 07:30 in North Carolina in autumn, and she thought about the specific weight of the Barrett M82 on her back on the New Mexico range in the mornings before the sun came all the way up. The cold and the clarity and the distance target and the mathematics of it. All those variables that could ruin everything if she wasn't precise. All those variables she had learned to account for until the rifle and the mathematics and the distance felt like a single continuous thing she was part of. She had become very good at something that should not have been necessary. She was going to be good at the next thing too. Garrett Vance was indicted in the contracting case 6 weeks after Lund. She was not directly responsible for Vance's indictment. The financial investigators had found the Florida property through the prosecution's discovery process. The original evidence package had pointed them at the Lund-Vance relationship, but the specifics of the Florida arrangement had been found independently by people who were very good at following money through property records. She noted this with something like satisfaction. She had built the structure to surface the information, and then the information had moved on its own, as information in the right channels does when the channels are working. Vance's company lost its current contracts immediately. The 4-year, $340 million arrangement with Lund's Theatre was terminated for cause and referred to the DODIG. She read about it in a brief item at the bottom of a financial news page. The prior incidents KIA, the 2 soldiers whose families had been told equipment malfunction, were mentioned in a congressional statement by the Intelligence Committee member who had received her package. Not by name in public, but the families had been notified. She knew this through Sonia. They had been told the truth. She thought about what that meant for them. Not resolution, not repair, not the return of anything. Just the truth, just the accurate account of what had happened and why and who had decided it. She had decided a long time ago in the Korengal Valley, as the radio went quiet, that the truth was what she was going after. Not a feeling, not a moment, not retribution that she could hold in her hands. The truth in the record, where it could not be unwritten. It was in the record. She submitted the reinstatement request 3 months after the Lund indictment. The request was processed through a legal and administrative framework that took 11 months. There were officers in the chain who opposed it. Not formally, but with the particular brand of institutional resistance that operates through delay and procedural complication rather than direct objection. She waited. She had become very patient. The reinstatement was approved 14 months after she submitted the request. The conditions were administrative, a review period, a fitness evaluation, a readiness assessment that she completed in 2 days over a weekend at a range in Virginia with an evaluating officer who watched her shoot a Barrett M82 at 1,800 meters and wrote in the assessment, "No degradation in proficiency. Recommend full reinstatement to operational status." She received the paperwork on a Tuesday morning. She read it. She signed it. She was a soldier again, not exactly as she had been. The year and a half outside had left marks that were not visible on any fitness report, but that she carried in the way she moved through any room. The particular attention of a person who has spent extended time operating alone, who has learned to trust her own assessment because there was no one else's assessment available, who had been to 1,100 meters in a Vermont forest and 3,400 meters on a Georgia range and 2,200 meters in New Mexico, and had done all of it without being told to. She was the same soldier. She was also something more than she had been. She ran into Martinez at a training facility in North Carolina, 18 months after his surgery. He walked with a slight lean to the right, barely perceptible, the kind of gait shift that only shows at speed. He was running a qualification course when she arrived, and she watched him move through it with the particular controlled aggression of a man who has decided that his body's limitation is a problem to be managed around rather than acknowledged. He saw her when he came off the course. He said, without stopping, "Staff Sergeant." She said, "Sergeant." He said, "You look the same." She said, "You move differently." He said, 4 centimeters of reconstructed femoral sheath and a titanium pin. The pin sets off metal detectors, which I find funny. She said, "Are you back at full?" He said, "Full enough." They stood for a moment. He looked at her, the way people look at someone they last saw under conditions where the ordinary markers of rank and protocol had stopped applying. He said, "What happened to the investigation? Do you know how it came out?" She said, "I know how it came out." He said, "Good?" She said, "Better than nothing. The right people are in legal trouble. The 2 KIA from the previous incident are acknowledged in the record. Their families have the truth." He nodded. He said, "That's not nothing." She said, "No." He said, "It doesn't." He stopped. She waited. He said, "It doesn't put anyone back, but it's something." She said, "Yes." They ran a course together after that. He was slower than he had been. She matched his pace without making a production of it. He did not acknowledge it. She did not expect him to. That was the kind of thing you did for the people you had been in the dark with, and it didn't require narration. She burned the list the day her reinstatement was final. Not dramatically. She was in a concrete block room at a training facility with a metal wastebasket. She put the list in the wastebasket, struck a match, and watched it go. The list had been, in practice, memorized for 18 months. She had not needed the physical copy since the first weeks, but she had kept it. It had been a form of commitment a record she maintained because something in her required a tangible accounting. She watched it burn. 4 names, all resolved. Lund. In federal prosecution, the indictment moving through the process at the pace federal indictments move. His contracting partner, separately indicted. Contracts terminated. The aide who had modified the log. Cooperating witness protected. The system that had produced all of it, not changed but documented. On record. Harder to run the same play again with the record in the open. The wastebasket cooled. She left the room. She went to the range. She set up at the 1,800-meter position on the training facility's long range. The range was empty at 0600. Cold. The air was still. She had an hour before the facility opened to scheduled use. She deployed the Barrett M82 on its bipod. She checked the environmental data. Wind, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. She dialed in the required corrections. She settled into position. 1,800 meters is the weapon's official effective range. At 1,800 meters, a .50 caliber BMG round is in the air for just under 2 seconds. The shot requires accounting for the Coriolis effect at that distance, the rotational effect of the Earth on a projectile in flight, which is not trivial. She had run the calculation. She had the correction dialed. She fired. She hit. She fired 11 more rounds. She hit 11 more times. She broke down the rifle. She packed it. She stood up and looked down the range at the target, which was not visible from 1,800 meters, which was as it should be. She was back. Not exactly where she had started. Somewhere forward from there, in the direction she had been moving since the night a radio went quiet, and she had kept going anyway. The range was still empty. The light was coming up over the tree line on the eastern edge of the facility. The early low-angle light of a morning that hadn't fully committed yet. She picked up the rifle case. She walked off the range. She carries the weight of the Barrett M82 the way she always has. Distributed properly, spine straight, arms in, the weight absorbed by the structure of her body rather than fought against. She has carried it at 3,400 meters in the Georgian foothills, and at 2,200 in New Mexico, and at 1,100 in a Vermont forest, and at 1,800 in North Carolina. She has not carried anyone in the Korengal Valley. She carried Martinez to the medevac, but she did not carry the 4 people who did not make it out. They do not work that way, the losses. They do not sit in a place you can pack and redistribute. They sit in you, in the specific weight of silence on a frequency that was supposed to be live, in the particular way Osei looked at her across a courtyard, when they both understood what the silence meant, in the 3 centimeters of scar on Osei's forearm. She carries all of it. She is not looking for it to be otherwise. She is looking for the next correct action, which is what she has always been looking for. It is the only navigation she has trusted since the night she first understood that the larger institutions could fail. You move to the next correct action. You do not stop. You account for the variables you can account for, and you accept the variance you cannot. You are precise about what is in your control. She is one of the best long-range shooters on this planet. She has a list of 4 names, all resolved. She has the evidence she built over 18 months, and the testimony she gave, and the record that now contains the truth about what happened to her team, and the truth about what happened to the other team, the one that came before. She is a soldier. She is standing on the range at 0615, the light just over the tree line, the Barrett in its case on her back. And there is nothing in the world that requires her right now. She is simply here, simply present, simply herself. The wind off the tree line moves through the grass at the range edge. She listens to it. A general with 8 bodyguards had signed an order that left her team in the dark. She had spent 18 months making sure that order followed him. Not a moment, not a feeling, not a headline, a record. In federal court, in congressional oversight, in the memories of 2 families who now know the truth about how they lost someone. She had done it alone. She had done it with a Barrett M82.50 caliber, and a evidence package, and 11 minutes on a Vermont deck, and the patience of a person who had been to 3,400 meters and learned that the distance is not the obstacle. The distance is the proof that you can reach what other people cannot. She does not need the world to know this. The world will not know this. The world will know about the indictment and the contracting case and the modified log. And those things will make their way through the legal system at the pace such things move. Some people will go to prison. Some will not. The record will contain the truth, and that cannot be unwritten. She does not need credit for what made that possible. She is somewhere at the edge of a training facility in North Carolina. The morning is cold and clear, and she has done what she came to do, and she has come back to where she started, which is standing somewhere with the weight of the rifle on her back and the work ahead of her and the capacity to go toward it. She turns from the range toward the road. The morning opens around her. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of what these 4 soldiers carried and what she carried for them, hit like. It keeps these stories alive. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. She walks until the range is behind her, until the road takes her where the road takes her, until there is no trace left of her on the facility ground, except the 12 impact points in a target at 1,800 meters that the next shooter on that range will find and wonder at, and not know the answer to. She does not leave answers. She leaves evidence.